Today we continue our discussion of the ancient empires and their contributions. Some of the ancient empires have disappeared, and one of the reasons seems to be they were persistent in maintaining the status quo. They needed an infusion of new ideas into their pattern of daily living, and this involved providing for a more healthful society. The potential energy that needed to be released and channeled into a proper stream of thought came from the ancient Greeks. They took the leap forward that was needed. They provided leadership, as you well know, in many creative areas. We find their creativity in art, in philosophy, in many of the sciences, math, physics, astronomy, and fortunately also in medicine. Now, as you look at it, I think we could safely say that there were three major schools of thought in the area of medicine. The first would be the ancient magical, mystical type. We could call it the primitive form of medical care. The second, a purely philosophical school. And the third, a rational school that was based on the collection of scientific data, skilled observation, and very carefully thought out plans that involved skilled reasoning. It's interesting to consider that in a setting that was intellectually stimulating and politically very far advanced, we still had the primitive aspects. For instance, the setting where patients were brought was still the temples. They still used supplication as far as the pantheon of gods and goddesses which they had. Probably the most famous god of medicine is Asclepius. And you know that the staff that he carried with him with the serpent entwined around it has been the basis for the medical symbol. His daughter Hygeia, the goddess of health, and understand it was health, is also very famous. The Epidaurus is one of the most outstanding sanatoria that we have. It's in a beautiful setting. Architecturally, it was beautiful. There was provision for entertainment, for recreation. And when a person came to the Epidaurus, first of all, the patient bathed, then made a sacrifice of some sort, and then went to one of the porches and went to sleep. Soothing music played, and then the person dreamed. Somebody had to interpret these dreams. Now, this is really very interesting, and particularly in view of the fact that a recent book has come out on the clinical interpretation of dreams. They went to the oracles to beg for prognosis of their diseases, just as you might well imagine. Now, there's something else. Thucydides, who's probably the oldest historian, has given us a very vivid account of an epidemic in Athens, probably bubonic plague. This is the first clear-cut account of a communicable disease in a community. It's interesting that the people built fires in order to purify the air because it was their feeling that the air had been polluted. Now let's think a little bit about the philosophical school. And all I will say is that one of the leaders in this school was Aristotle. Using his excellent base of philosophy, he laid the basis for psychology, which we needed. Now then, the rational school was the most important one in the history of the care of the sick, and the leader was Hippocrates. He had no misconceptions about demons or evil spirit influences. He stressed understanding the person who is a patient. Doesn't that have a familiar ring? But it's a switch. Now he really stays at the person's side. His bedside manner was excellent. He stressed the need for skilled people to really understand the needs of each person. He was probably one of the greatest teachers of clinical medicine we've ever had. He has awakened an interest in the need for the well-prepared, the prepared observer, at the person's side. He watched how a person slept, how a person's pulse and temperature fluctuated. He advised studying the background of the patients, their habits. This is all in line with some of the newer concepts in nursing today. He also was interested in the humoral theory. When the body was in harmony with nature and with the person's self, the person was at ease. When the body was out of harmony and there was an imbalance of substances in the body, the person was suffering from dis-ease or disease. He also had the honesty to report when he wasn't successful. He felt that we would not get anywhere unless we prevented the same mistakes from being made. Could it have been this imbalance of humors in the body that he wanted to be sure people understood? Could it have been that he understood something about the endocrine and the biochemical imbalances that we know of today? When a person went to the temple, the person left an example of the ailment that the person had. This is really quite unique because artists emphasized perfection of the body. The Greeks emphasized a perfect body, even in their recreation. You know that from the Olympics. Artists toiled with their hands, and this made them not on a high level. Their intellectual skills always took precedence over manual skills. Now, this has an interesting connotation, as you can see, as far as medicine is concerned, because a surgeon was never on as high a level as a physician because he worked with his hands. I want you to remember in closing and thinking about the Greek medicine, they never were exclusively curative. There was an emphasis on the preservation of health. Now let's think about the ancient Romans. The setting, politically and militarily aggressive. You know that they were influenced by a pantheon of gods. Hepatoscopy was still a part of their thinking. True, now they had bronze models that they used, but the idea still persisted. Their recreation at times was absolutely as bizarre as it could possibly be. You know all about the Colosseum and their activities there. They also really did quite a bit of trauma, really, to their gastrointestinal tract, because National Geographic has given us quite an accurate reproduction of a dinner orgy. And you know how long these banquets lasted and what they did at them. There's a slave economy here. They were waited on. Even the slave economy permeated into the field of the care of the sick, because whatever nursing, quote unquote, was done was the forced occupation of slaves. There was, though, many slum areas that they had, which they had to cope with, so that they became leaders in the field of public health. Their water supply was brought by clay pipes from a clear water reservoir. They had good sewerage systems. Their baths were quite outstanding. You are seeing the baths of Caracalla. And it is here that they spent hours, and they emphasized the body and bathing. Really, they carried it to an extreme. They did have a Greek doctor, and you know that the Greeks were brought over as conquered people, and they took care of the Romans. One of the famous Greek doctors in the ancient Roman period is Galen. Galen did an excellent job in expanding our knowledge of physiology. He dissected bodies, but he also cared for patients in a physician status. You are seeing him as he is applying cups to a little boy's body. Actually, I have a Roman lamp here, which is the type that Galen is holding in using the cups, excluding the air, and applying them to a patient's body. Celsus was another very important doctor, and he is the one who identified the cardinal symptoms of inflammation: redness, swelling, heat, pain. We still use these. Let's turn our attention to one other ancient group, the ancient Irish. They are interesting because the early Brehon laws emphasized a family plan for medical care. The laws identified the care to the poor, the care of the aged, and they did not have the geriatric problems that others had. They had a responsibility and they carried it out. They cared for the sick very carefully. They had laws that said certain visitors were not permitted because they made the patient less comfortable. The doctor himself had to abide by certain Rayan laws, and they inveighed against quacks and those people whom we would consider imposters. They had very interesting obstetrical procedures, and when a woman was ready to deliver, she had exercise, kept her muscles in good tone. She came in, she would kneel, have her baby, and the baby then was placed in a little hammock at the foot of her bed. This probably was the first example of rooming in. You know, today we say this is a very modern concept, and you're seeing a picture of a mother who presses a button, pulls out a drawer, and there her baby is available for her to take care of. This was used a long time ago by the ancient Irish. The ancient Hindus gave us a great deal. The influence of medicine on society was great. You know, the ancient religious books of India, the Vedas, also contained medical content and viewpoint. They did, however, have primitive aspects. The medicine man was important. But let's think of the creative aspects. They were outstanding in their skill in surgery. Plastic surgery was performed at a very early period in ancient India. Actually, they did many surgical procedures. It's interesting to note that they had tranquilizers. Actually, our tranquilizers came from India, and probably this enabled them to do so much surgery. They had good medical teaching techniques, and the medical student had to practice before he went and took care of patients. The medical leadership, two of them, Charaka and Susruta, have gone down in history for their outstanding excellence in caring for the sick as well as medical teaching. You are seeing Susruta as he teaches. He is caring for the sick, and he is also preparing the next generation of doctors. It is interesting that the ancient Hindus also recognized the need for the skilled person to be at the patient's side. This was an awakening that had to come. There is no identification of a nurse by name, however. Now let's turn our attention to the ancient Chinese. They are a very interesting group of people, and many of the ancient practices still continue to the present day. They were influenced, their living as well as the care of the sick, according to their religious beliefs. This played a very large part in their thinking. Many primitive aspects of patient care can be noted. Acupuncture was one of the ancient forms of medical care that was used, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about acupuncture. This was the needle that was used, or the type of needle. It is a silver needle that's very flexible, as you can see. It's very sharp, but very flexible. It's wound around at the top with gold twine or gold thread. The doctor, the old Chinese doctor, would take this needle and with a twisting motion put it in the patient's body. You are seeing a patient who has the acupuncture needles being implanted in his head and around in his sinuses where he is bothered. There were many teaching models that were available so that a student understood where to put the needles and how these needles went in. You're seeing a current day picture of a doctor showing the nurse how to implant these needles. This treatment, you should know, today is done by nurses. Moxa is another treatment. This was the glowing coals, like punk, and they were placed on a person's body to burn out infection. Massage was used, and a blind person often did this. Smallpox immunization was done from ancient times. And actually, it's kind of an interesting technique because the old Chinese doctor blew the scab of a person with smallpox up into the nose of a healthy person. You certainly didn't have to worry about a poxmark with this particular type of treatment. Now, the old-time Chinese and Japanese medicine man carried with him that which we called an inro. The inro has several little compartments, and these compartments were actually, the inro was worn by the Chinese medicine man in this way. He carried with him a number of medicines, as many as this little inro could hold. This particular one is interesting because one of the compartments still has some of the medicine that was used by the early Chinese medicine man. The gentleman who really gave us a basis for Chinese medicine was the man who's considered the god of medicine in ancient China, and his name was Shen Nung. He experimented with many Chinese medicines, and he has listed in all about 365 medicines. This is one of the greatest contributions of ancient China to our knowledge today. I am pleased and proud to introduce a guest speaker we have with us today, Dr. King Salmon, who is known professionally as Dr. King. We're very happy to have you today, Dr. King. Dr. King practiced medicine in China for 18 years. She taught medical students there. Actually, she's given me a new insight and a far greater respect for the Chinese and their ideas of medicine. I think you'd enjoy a book which is to be published called A House of 1,000 Babies, which she has written. Dr. King, the old theory of animism still persists in many places, and I'm sure you probably saw it in China. Could you give us a story or an example about this?
Yes. One day, a very ill patient entered the hospital. She had childbed fever, and we took a blood culture and knew that it was a streptococcal infection. And this was in the pre-antibiotic days. And after we had used all the anti-streptococcal serum and all the other forms of streptococcal infections, she was no better. And so I called for her husband to explain to him the seriousness of the situation. And I found that the husband believed that his wife was plagued by evil spirits, little devil spirits as he called them. It seems that he had been married previously, and his first wife had died without leaving a son to the family. This new wife had produced a son, and they believed that this first wife had sent evil spirits to plague the new mother. I tried at once to explain to him something about infections, that she had an infection. And I even told him about the blood culture that we had taken, which showed the streptococcus. And in order to really make him understand that his wife was not plagued with devils, but had an infection, I took him over to the laboratory and showed him some of the slides which showed the streptococci in the bloodstream. And he looked at them some time, and then his face lit up a bit, and he said, "Ah, so that is what the little devil spirits looks like."
Oh, isn't that something? Now, as I listen to this story, I can see three things here. Here you have the evil eye influence, the devils within the body sort of concept, but I get the message from you that scientific presentation isn't enough. We have to understand the culture of the people and their thinking, don't we, in taking care of them. Dr. King, you also have told me about pulse and their concept of pulse. Would you explain this?
Yes. The Chinese always use both hands in taking the pulse of a patient like this. And you have to use 3 fingers and put it over the area of the pulse. Now, the Chinese old-style doctors say that the pulse on of the left hand of the patient tells you the condition of the heart and the liver and of the kidneys. And the pulse on the right hand of the patient tells you the condition of the lungs and the spleen and the genital organs. This is a practice that the old-style Chinese doctors used very frequently. While I was teaching at St. John's University Medical School in the physiology department, we studied the pulse with a sphygmograph, tracing the pulse. And at the end, one very good student came to me, and he said he had traced repeatedly the pulse of his classmates, but he still wasn't satisfied. He said the old-style Chinese doctor was able to make the diagnosis with taking the pulse. And he suggests tactfully, he said, perhaps the pulse of the Chinese is different than the pulse of the Westerners. And therefore, the Westerners couldn't use this method. And I said, Chang, I want you to take the sphygmograph home with you and take the tracing of every one of your father's patients and give for 3 weeks and give me the diagnosis of what your father, by feeling the pulse, had obtained, and the pulse tracings. And I said, you and I'll publish a paper and show how you believe that the pulse of the Chinese is different than the pulse of the Western. And Chang was delighted, and he took it home, and about 3 weeks later, he brought it back, and he said sorrowfully, Dr. King, we can't publish a paper. Alas, my father's method has nothing to it.
Isn't that interesting? Now, here is a young student who has the willingness to change, who is willing to use new ideas. There's something else that I think you would be interested in. Dr. King brought this medicine doll. Dr. King, women are reluctant to be examined. Could you tell us about this?
Yes, the old-style Chinese woman would never be examined by a male physician. However, the physician, if he went to the home to visit or to take care of the sick, he would bring this doll along, and the husband or some other member of the family would point to the spot where the pain or the difficulty lay, and then he would give the supposedly good, the correct medicine for that condition.
I think this is very interesting, and I wanted you to see one of these because they are rare. I think that's a very interesting thing, and the old-time Chinese doctor carried this in his pocket. Dr. King, would you tell us about the feeling in relation to delirium?
Well, the Chinese believe that when a patient is in delirium, that the shen, or the spirit of the patient, has left the body and is wandering around, unable to find it again. And of course, if he does recover from delirium, they say, well, the shen is back in the body.
Isn't that interesting? Wet nurses are used in China, aren't they, still today?
Yes.
Would you tell us just a little bit about those?
Well, the high-class Chinese woman will not nurse her baby. And because she considers it beneath her. And so she always has a wet nurse. At our hospital, we had to insist that no wet nurse would be allowed to nurse our little babies until they had had a Wassermann and a test for trachoma.
I think this is very good. This is one way, though, where infection could be transmitted unknowingly if the proper person hadn't been
That's correct.
found. Night soil was also used, wasn't it, in China when you were there?
Oh, my, yes.
As a form of fertilizer.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And this again transmitted infection.
Yes, that's the reason why we had amoebic dysentery and bacillary dysentery and typhoid and all the different worm infections and so forth is because of the use of night soil.
Night soil. The that I would like to have you tell us very briefly is the one about how important it was to be sure that it was an appropriate day for certain things, such as building.
Oh, yeah. Well, I learned about this when I was to build the medical students' dormitories at the Women's Christian Medical College. An architect and all the blueprints and the plans were finished, and I had to get a permit from the native city, the Chinese native city of Shanghai, and we applied for a permit, but we got no permit, and we applied again and again, and finally the business manager of the hospital told me, he said, well, Dr. King, you probably won't get a permit until you consult the feng shui. That is, the feng shui is the wind and the water. They are, well, you can find them in any shopping district. So I paid the fee for feng shui, and at once we had a permit to build the building. Now, the feng shui supposedly was to see that the building was being placed in such a position that it was advantageous to the wind and the waters and so forth.
I'm sure people could feel this way about whether they'd have surgery or not.
Yes.
Well, as we think through the contributions of the ancient groups, I'm sure that you can see that we had an excellent basis for clinical medicine, and I think the most thrilling thing is at last there was a real awakening of the need for a well-prepared nurse.